Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. New realities, new challenges. The coronavirus pandemic has brought about economic chaos across the world. But what about geopolitics? What are the opportunities and what are the dangers? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest. We have Glenn Giesen in Oslo. He is a professor at the Higher School of Economics, as well as author of The Decay of Western Civilization and Resurgence of Russia. In Moscow, we have Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst and editor at InnoSME Internet Project. And in London, we cross to Marcus Papadopoulos. He is editor-in-chief of Politics First magazine. Gentlemen, welcome to my home. Welcome to Crosstalk. We're going to continue this format until we're given a clean bill of health at work, and we'll be watching the pandemic around the world as it goes here. In the programs that I've talked about the economics of all of this, and I've talked about how it's affecting domestic politics, but we really haven't touched in this program the geopolitical implications of this, because this is a pandemic, but it's also a geopolitical tsunami, maybe. Because if you look at the Trump administration, I'm directing this to Glenn right now, they're just upping the ante with Venezuela, upping the ante with Iran, stirring up more trouble in Iraq. In many ways, it looks like business as usual, but as Pat Buchanan wrote in the American Conservative, this is a wonderful opportunity to disengage all of these senseless adventures around the world. But the Trump administration doesn't see that as an opportunity. Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, I guess most governments never let, or large countries never let a crisis go to waste. And so there are always opportunities in crisis. And of course, it depends what kind of opportunity you're looking for. Now, you're very correct. If the United States would want to disentangle from all these foreign wars, it suddenly now has a great opportunity to withdraw. But again, you have it can go the other way as well. So, for example, with the United States, it's increased its sanctions now on Iran in order to put more pressure on Iran as it's less capable of tackling the coronavirus. So essentially, we're using this virus as an instrument against the Iranians. But then what I found was interesting was because the United States also had much of soldiers which were now deployed to Europe for a large military exercise, they had to withdraw. And what was interesting is Russia actually responded in kind by canceling its major military exercise along its western borders, despite not having the same problems with the coronavirus. So essentially, you saw that this could be a possibility also for reducing tensions. So it's hard to say which direction is going, but obviously all governments are looking for a major opportunity. Depends, of course, as you mentioned, how do they define this opportunity? I guess the rest of the world obviously would prefer if the United States scaled back its foreign deployments to a large extent.
Well, there's a good part of the American electorate that feels the same way, but their voices are not being heard. Marcus, the same question to you, but maybe in a different way. We have a new Cold War, and it's more and more with China. If you look at the rhetoric coming out of the United States and out of both political parties in different elements of the media, but this focus on China, which of course comes at a very interesting time when trade agreements are in play. Phase one is done. They're working on other ones. This has all been put on ice for the time being because of this pandemic. How does this pandemic change that perception of China for foreign policy elites in the United States and the Western world in general?
Well, first of all, Peter, I would like to start by saying that the fact that eminent dissenting scientists and medical doctors in the world are not being given a platform by Western mainstream media is most disconcerting. And if you do not find that alarming, then more fool you. Now, turning to the geopolitics of the virus, what it demonstrates is that the pursuit of geopolitical objectives by the West continues unabated. If we take the case of Russia, Russia has sent significant levels of humanitarian aid, and the response of Western mainstream media, principally in Britain and in America, has been to project that as the Kremlin flexing its soft power.
Trojan horse, yeah.
Trojan horse, which is absolutely scandalous. And let me tell Crosstalk viewers that what the Kremlin is doing at the moment in Italy is in accordance with a Soviet-era tradition of international solidarity. If we take the case of Serbia, the president of that country, a certain Alexander Vučić, who is open in his servile collaborator status of the West, has now closed the border with Kosovo and Metohija. He has closed the border to a part of Serbia. That is in accordance with what his masters in Washington and in Brussels are telling him to do, because Vučić is laying the ground for Serbia to recognize the independence of the so-called Republic of Kosovo. Turning to China, I believe that this coronavirus pandemic is going to enable those on Capitol Hill to take an even more hardline approach with China. And what we could see, Peter, is the introduction of additional justification for that. No different to how we have seen.
Let me push back on that a little bit, because one of the things that I was really disappointed in, I mean, this stimulus package or bailout, whatever you want to call it, is scandalous on so many different levels. It's abhorrent. But one of the things that I was hoping for, that would be readdressing supply chains. So, I mean, on the one hand, it's very rhetorical when it comes to an anti-China policy, but there seems to be a great deal of hesitation to really change the way business is being done. And you talked later in the program about economic nationalism, where I think it's very important to talk about. So I agree with you, Marcus, on that, but it doesn't seem to come through with the policy. And let me go to Dima on this here too, because I think this is something that's going to be evolving. I mean, a lot of governments, particularly in the West, have realized just how dependent they are on China. And it's not an accident. I mean, these companies, these medical companies, pharmaceuticals, they just moved all of their production to China. Nobody forced them to do it. And this is one of the things I really hate about this anti-China mentality, is that, the Chinese didn't force anyone to invest in their country, okay? I mean, it's these business elites that, by the way, just got bailed out. They're the ones that did this, without ever thinking about medical security, health security. Go ahead, Dima.
Well, I agree with you completely that has revealed how vulnerable Western societies are to the system that they themselves created, to globalization. But I think it would be a tragedy if we came out of all of this unchanged. I think there are two things that can really be changed by coronavirus. First, the discreditation of the European Union. I mean, it cracked up to be absolutely unable to help Italy and now Spain and many more countries in the future. So that's the first change that can come about. We absolutely need a different Europe. That's for sure. The second important change is possible lifting or easing of American sanctions. In the American Conservative, which is an independent media outlet inside the United States, during the last week blasted the policy of sanctions. One of them was written by Daniel Larison, who basically pointed to the fact that American sanctions regime against Iran is very dangerous for the United States, because people infected with the virus are coming to Afghanistan. The refugees are coming to Afghanistan. Afghanistan still has a huge American community operating there, not only the military people. These people are going to come back to the United States. Then another good example is, the unwillingness of the United States to lift the sanctions on Venezuela. Venezuela is just nearby. If the pandemic gets worse there, there is no way the United States will be immune. So we have this sanctions policy operating against the American society, against its vital interest. And when I read the New York Times, for example, it seems to me that I'm out of mirrors. On one page you have an article, choose who can be saved. That article tells us how the medical capacity of the United States is not sufficient to treat all the patients. So people are just left to die. On the other hand, we have someone named James Carafano, from the Heritage Foundation saying that we should maintain the sanctions regime against Iran, we should toughen the sanctions against Venezuela, we should continue pressuring China. Everyone knows that these sanctions cost tens of billions.
Well, it's really interesting what you're mentioning. I mean, irrespective of the policy or the country or even the pundit, I'm going to direct this to Glenn, is that as we all expected on this program and viewers of this program, the elites want to maintain the status quo, even if it doesn't work, okay? Particularly if it doesn't work for the populations that they have control over. I was going to say govern, but no, it's not governing. It's because if you look the way the bailout package was passed in Congress, nobody wants to put their name on it. Nobody wants to take any responsibility for $2 trillion, because if people find out how they vote, it will haunt them in the future by people like us and people watching this program. The status quo must be maintained. That's the message I get out of this crisis. Go ahead, Glenn.
But I think it's not necessarily up to them anymore, because I would argue that this has to some extent become a continuation of the global financial crisis of 08 and 9. Because if you remember when this happened, the two countries that were very alarmed was China and Russia, because they recognized that in response to the crisis, the United States needed more fiscal discipline. And they saw that the solution to debt and consumption was more debt and more consumption. So around this time, you saw a great decoupling beginning. So both China and Russia has begun to look for alternative or autonomy within technologies, develop alternative industries, new transportation corridors, been hoarding more and more gold, developing alternative payment systems. And so across the board, there's been a bit of a decoupling, waiting, essentially recognizing that when the next crisis comes, it's going to be difficult for the United States to weather that storm. So I think that at the end of this, when the dust settles, I don't see China and Russia integrating in a hurry under this US-led economic system. So I think it's going to be, I think that's going to be the largest repercussion of this coronavirus, because there were many people have been waiting for when the next economic crisis would hit, but no one really expected it to be hit in this kind of way with this pandemic. So, that would be my greatest expectation in terms of how this would play out. But of course, this changes a lot of the rhetoric around it, and I agree with what was said before as well. This competition now for the narrative has become very important, because for China, they have now positioned themselves essentially as the savior, as a well, it's not savior, but as helping out the Italians when their neighbors aren't even doing it. While for the United States now, they really have to reshape the narrative as they are the villain, they're the one who caused it. So there's a battle both on the economic and information front here, obviously.
Well, the optics are really, really interesting. Is that you have China and Russia helping members of the EU, while the United States goes and sanctions the populations essentially of Iran and Venezuela. That paradigm is not changing for the West and for the Washington consensus here. But I think the lesson to be learned, just to kind of continue on what Glenn was saying there, I'll go to Marcus here, is that Glenn is absolutely right, and I've seen it with my own eyes, this decoupling from the Western financial system, because it's very toxic, and it's been proven again. Nothing was fixed in 2008, 2009. All they did was just pump it up, okay? And refuse to see its failings and weaknesses. As long as the government, you're too big to fail, why change? That's the message we're getting again in 2020. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, and in regard to the financial crash, Peter, of 2008, we know that was caused by bankers. And how many bankers, Peter, in America and in Britain were charged, prosecuted, and sent to prison? We are talking about unbelievably minimal numbers. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you more than just anything else. It reaffirms the reality that the banking elite are very much a part of the American establishment and the British establishment, and both establishments are not going to take any action against their own people. And turning to the European Union, my submission is that one of the main victims, if not the main victim of the coronavirus, is that it will weaken the European Union's very existence, its very foundation. Why? Because the way Italy and also Spain has been left on their own to fight this virus demonstrates that there is no collective identity within the European Union. There is no collective solidarity within the European Union. And that should serve as a warning to people in countries such as Ukraine and in Serbia, who have been promised that admission to the European Union will be heaven on earth, so to speak. That is not the case. And that is something that, as I say, people outside of the European Union whose political elite are telling them that joining the European Union would be best for the ordinary man and woman in their child should look to how Italy and Spain have been forsaken by.
They failed the test in a big way. Dima, you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, with Ukraine, it was an unprecedented situation this week because basically the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, whom the West praised so much, he did something no government had done before. He shut off the borders to his own citizens.
His own people, yeah.
Friday, last week, Ukrainians cannot return to Ukraine from other countries. Even if there is a chance for them to pay a huge amount of money to have special planes take them back, they will not be admitted. You know, this is unprecedented. And the Western media did not criticize Mr. Zelensky for doing that. Instead, the Western media kept asking the question, how come Russia has so few cases? We have to look closer into that. There must be something Putin is hiding. Zelensky has just done something that is criminal, you know. He left his own citizens, millions of them working in Italy, in Spain, you know. Ukrainians were given this visa-free status to go to Europe. They were not given work permits, but they were given an opportunity to travel freely by Poroshenko. Now, this boon turns into a huge problem because there are millions of Ukrainians who are stuck in Italy and in Spain. And the Western media is not concerned about that. They were not concerned when there was an anti-Russia rally held in Kiev recently. You know, the Western media reported about these people as heroes, you know. They massed in thousands in the center of Kiev to protest against Putin's occupation of Donbass. And Western media was not concerned that actually...
They weren't concerned that 1.2, 1.3 Ukrainians moved to Russia during all of this either. It was their choice, actually, okay? Let me go to Glenn here now. I touched upon it earlier, but this whole issue of economic nationalism, which I don't like the term because it evokes the wrong images and ideas, and we have to come up with, I think it's more like economic sovereignty or something like that I think is more appropriate. And that is an interesting lesson to be learned here, or should be learned at least from all of this, is that there are certain sectors of the economy that the nation state should be held responsible for. And I think this pandemic is made that obvious and true, and we'll see what if those lessons are learned, because when you have over 90% of your pharmaceuticals being produced in a country that you now deem as a hostile power, I mean, this is common sense stuff here. I did a crosstalk before we went into quarantine, and I got a lot of pushback. You know, and I just said, I'm just not ideological about it. I'm not ideological about capitalism. Capitalism is fine if it works for the majority of people. If it doesn't, then we need to think about it, because economies exist for people, not for ideas. And I think this is the elites, and particularly neoliberals, forget that idea. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, no, well, there's a lot of misunderstandings around economic nationalism because, well, one of the key economic nationalist policies first advanced was in the United States, pushed by Alexander Hamilton. The whole idea is that you need sovereignty over your industrial power in order to function as a sovereign state. For the US, the experience was they shouldn't be too economically dependent on Britain. That's why they developed the American system. Now, obviously, for America's adversaries, they realize this, like a modern economic nationalism would suggest that they can't really be too dependent on America's financial system, its currencies, its technologies, because that would impede its ability to act as a sovereign state. As even countries like Russia is recognizing with all these sanctions now being pushed against it, that you need certain economic autonomy. Now, obviously, this is more something that the adversaries of the United States have recognized for a while now, given that they tend to be at the other side getting the economic punishment. Now, usually traditionally we've seen this applied more to, for example, agriculture. You need to supply your own food, and also the financial system. But I guess now that we look for the United States, they're really recognizing this as well in terms of their medicines, because in all fairness, they outsourced essentially all the production of all their medicines to China. And as tensions now intensifying between the Americans and Chinese, this is a horrible situation for the Americans.
Let's be clear. Why did they outsource it all? Why did they do it?
Well, that was not again. This is private companies making that decision to save money. And again, this is why often you need government to step in as well to say, listen, this is an issue of national sovereignty and security. We might have to produce it domestically because these are strategic industries. But
you would probably be kicked off Twitter for saying that. Okay. I mean, that's almost criminal. It's almost criminal to say you should protect your country. And you should protect your people. Ask Italians what it means, the word sovereignty. Ask them. I bet you they have a lot to say about it. Dima, you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, there are 2 points I wanted to make, about the European Union. One of the few things the European Union introduced was sanctions against Russia. That's a collective decision which is obligatory for EU members. You can't change it. It already cost Europe and Russia, according to the United Nations estimates, more than 100 billion euros during the first 3 years of the sanctions only, and they have been lasting for 6 years now. So, if only a fraction of this money had been spent on masks, on ventilators, on medicine produced inside the EU, I'm sure tens of thousands of people could be saved. What did they kind of exchange it for? For pressuring Russia to return Crimea to Ukraine. Well, let me tell you, to our Western viewers, maybe not more than 1% of Crimea's population wants to go back to Ukraine. 99% wants to stay in Russia. So in order to make these 99%, agree to the EU's will, you have sacrificed tens of thousands of lives, because that's what it cost, financially. The other important point that Glenn made is about the financial power of the United States and of the European Union. In that other article against sanctions that was published in the American Conservative, article written by Francesco Giubilei from Italy.
Excellent article. Yeah.
That basically, even in the midst of crisis, the European Central Bank refused to cut the interest rates. They refused to change their policy because of the force majeure, because of what happened in Italy. Mr. Giubilei writes, this was perceived as a betrayal in Italy. This was perceived as EU's indifference. Now, US sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. These are sanctions not only against these countries. Any states in the world that want to trade with these countries, they also suffer the consequences, because the United States uses its financial power, its control of the dollar, in order to punish these countries. So we see how globalism is basically killing the healthcare systems around the world.
Well, it's also antithetical to the whole philosophy of free trade. It's just ridiculous here. Marcus, I want to give you the last word here. Please tell me that more and more people are going to start reassessing globalism as it stands today. Please do. Go ahead. Last word.
My hope, Peter, and I'm not optimistic about this, especially in the case of my country, Britain, is that one major lesson that people around the world will learn from the coronavirus is that they should reassess the nature of the system which is dominant in the world today, corporate capitalism, and that they should start studying conservatism, classical liberalism, classical capitalism, and classical communism. Because I will say this, Peter, I am neither a conservative nor a liberal. But when it comes to classical conservatism and classical liberalism, there are many elements which I fully subscribe to. And the world would be a better place if elements from classical conservatism, classical liberalism, classical capitalism, and classical communism were implemented in the world today, because corporate capitalism is not working. And people,
well, Marcus, on that note there, you've just come up with a topic for a wonderful crosstalk. Maybe we'll do it when I get back into the studio one day. I want to thank my guests in Oslo, Moscow, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.